April 1945. The men of the 83rd Infantry Division, 330th Infantry Regiment continue their advance into Germany. Having recently crossed the Rhine River, the division is now almost constantly on the move, attempting to keep pace with the 2nd Armored Division. It was clear to the men of the 83rd that the war was coming to an end, but it was also clear that victory would come at great cost. The men faced fierce and constant resistance from the enemy, including from troops the soldiers hadn't encountered before, like fanatical Hitler Youth troops who had spent the majority of their lives living in Hitler's Germany and would take any measures necessary to delay the Allied advance. Many other German soldiers accepted their reality around this time and surrendered to the Allies, meaning that the 83rd was handling large numbers of POWs on a daily basis. Because of their situation, the men of the 83rd had to travel light, relying on vehicles to transport additional equipment and resupply the division. The 83rd earned the nickname the Ragtag Circus because of how frequently they would repurpose captured enemy vehicles and equipment to support their advance into Germany. These men weren't special forces troops. Most were not highly trained, but these were the types of hard-fighting men who learned by doing and brought the fight straight to Hitler's doorstep to put an end to the Second World War. And this is what they carried.
Welcome to What They Carried. This is a new series I'm starting where I'll be breaking down the uniforms, gear, and other equipment used by soldiers during World War II. Today, I thought it'd be appropriate to start by talking about the 83rd Infantry Division because that's a group that I often represent at World War II reenactments, and it's a group that's very important but isn't talked about as much as some other divisions. I don't think it's safe for me to take off my gear here, so why don't we pull back from the front lines and go through this stuff somewhere a bit more comfortable.
Oh yeah, this is much better. Obviously, I can't go through every single item used by every single soldier in the 83rd Infantry, so today I'll give you a breakdown of what I feel is a fairly representative loadout that would have been carried by a rifleman in the 83rd in April of 1945. So I'll go through every piece of equipment I'm wearing right now, including every single little thing in my pockets, and I'll even go through my bedroll. That's the big roll of blankets and stuff like that that soldiers would typically leave in the rear that would be brought up on a vehicle if the soldiers were setting up somewhere for a night or two. If you're interested in more information on the stuff that I'm showing here, or you want to buy any of this stuff, I put together a comprehensive list of everything I'll be showing in this video, including links to where you can go buy this stuff right now. That list is available on my Patreon page. Click the link in the description to support my work on this channel by becoming a member, and when you do, you'll get access to that full document with links and everything. Now let's start talking about the gear that I have on, starting with my weapon right here, which is of course the famous M1 Garand rifle. This is the rifle that most troops would use throughout the war. There's nothing super special about it, but you will note that it has a web sling on it as opposed to the leather sling that was used earlier in the war. I'll also point out that if I open up the back of my M1 Garand here, that's where I'll keep my rifle cleaning supplies for the most part. So I have here a little oil pot with some grease inside, a combination tool that helps clean and disassemble the rifle, and also this oiler that has a little oil applicator. Along with my M1 Garand, of course, I'm going to need a lot of ammo. Soldiers at this point in the war typically carried a lot of ammo on their person. You can see that I have my cartridge belt on, which holds 10 N-block clips for the Garand, as well as an extra bandolier that holds 6 clips. The most important things that soldiers carried at this point was food, ammunition, and clothes to stay warm. And as I go through this, you'll see that that makes up the vast majority of what I have on right now. Next up, I'll go through my pack and some of the other gear that I'm wearing on my person here. Let me get this laid out on the table here so you can see it a little better. Now what I have here is the US M44 pack system. This pack was introduced fairly close to the end of the war, so since this is April of 1945, you do see some soldiers in the 83rd Infantry carrying this pack. Now, I included this pack because I wanted to show what a soldier would have carried in their pack if they had one, but a lot of soldiers in the 83rd at this time ditched their pack altogether. Now, a lot of these guys did have packs, but since they were constantly on the move, they would probably throw their packs on a truck or the back of a tank, the first option they got, so they didn't have to carry that stuff around, and then they could just live out of their pockets for a few days at a time. As I mentioned, I have this olive drab number 7 cartridge belt. This was the darker color of webbing used for web gear later in the war. You can see that the first aid kit I have here and the canteen cover are both in that same color. Inside my bandage pouch here, I would have a sealed Carlisle bandage and some sulfa powder contained in that kit. And then in my canteen pouch here, of course, I have my canteen as well as my canteen cup. These can be tricky to get out. You'll see later that I have my mess kit stuffed in my bedroll, so maybe if I was set up somewhere for a couple days at a time, I might eat out of my full mess kit, but typically a spoon and a canteen cup was all soldiers carried while they were on the move. And now let's talk about this pack that I have here. So you can see the first thing you might notice is on the front, I have this M43 entrenching tool with the later pattern cover here. On the side here, I have my bayonet for my M1 Garand rifle. Nothing too special here, just the standard bayonet. Of course, earlier in the war, you see the longer 16-inch blade bayonets. This is the 10-inch version, which at this point was pretty much all you would see soldiers carrying. If I did ditch this pack on a vehicle or in a building or just do away with it altogether, I would probably take this shovel and this bayonet and move them to my belt here. And then I would take my raincoat, which I have inside, and drape it over the back of my belt so I could keep it with me just in case. On the side of my pack here, I have a smoke grenade. Not all soldiers carried smoke grenades, but it would be pretty common to have at least 1 or 2 fragmentation grenades, and then maybe a smoke grenade, a thermite grenade, a white phosphorus grenade, some other type of grenade as well. Now inside of my pack here, I have some extra items, stuff that I wouldn't need immediately on my person in my pockets, but that might be handy after a couple days. So in this case, I have a war trophy, a little belt here. Carrying war trophies like this was very common, and the soldiers in the 83rd had been in combat for some time at this point. Even though the gear I'm wearing is fairly new and indicative of a recent replacement who just got on the front lines in the past month or two, it would still be very common for those guys to grab war trophies. They were in Germany, so that stuff was pretty much everywhere. I've got a little sea ration can here, some extra rations in addition to the stuff I have in my pockets, an extra dry pair of socks. I have another little war trophy here, just a little German pin. Some extra underwear. I would say these were less common to carry compared to socks, but a lot of soldiers still did carry some extra undies. Then I have a TL-122B flashlight. I have a sweater. I'm not wearing this right now, but you see soldiers wearing sweaters all the time at this point in the war, especially because the M43 jacket, which I'll talk about in a minute, was becoming very popular at this point. The previous M41 jacket, I think, was a much worse design, but that one did have a wool lining. And many soldiers said that if you were wearing an M43 jacket, you had to have something like a sweater underneath to insulate yourself a little better compared to that M41 jacket. And next up here, I have this raincoat that I talked about a minute ago. Now, some soldiers in the 83rd at this point in the war had been issued ponchos. You don't see ponchos too much in Europe until the very end of the war with certain units, but the 9th Army, which included the 83rd, was one of the armies to get issued a large number of ponchos. These rain jackets, although they're super fashionable, weren't liked very much by soldiers. They weren't very long. I don't know how well you can see, but they stopped just below my knee. Soldiers complained that their feet and shins would get soaking wet even if they had a big raincoat on. Soldiers still carried these around though, and even if they didn't wear them sometimes when it was raining, they would at least use these as a ground mat to sleep on or sit on top of. And that is everything inside of my M44 pack and my web gear. Now let's move on to talking about my uniform here and some of the stuff that I have in my pockets. So next up here, I'll tell you about the helmet I have on. This is just your standard M1 helmet, nothing too special about it, but I'll point out the helmet net that I have on here. What I have on my helmet here is a 1/4-inch small hole helmet net. This is often called the British style helmet net because the Brits made these and used them extensively. But you do see this used very often by certain divisions, and they were very common in the 83rd Infantry. I'm a bit of a helmet net nerd, so I'll tell you a bit more about the nets. You'll see in original photos, the 83rd is also using the helmet net with band, sometimes called the M44 net by collectors. Despite what it might look like, that's not just one of these helmet nets with a helmet band around it. That's actually a totally different style of helmet net that was issued with a band attached to it, and the holes are a little smaller than this. Underneath my helmet, you can see I have my Jeep cap on. This was a very common item to see soldiers wear because, you know, they like to have their ears warm. Your helmet doesn't provide a lot of warmth in those colder months. Now, like I said, I'm wearing the M43 jacket here. This was better than the previous M41 jacket that was used early in World War II for a number of reasons, in my opinion. I cover that pretty extensively in my most hated gear video if you want to check that out. You start seeing these M43 jackets used pretty early on, but even by the end of the war, some guys still had the older M41 jackets. It seems like with the 83rd specifically though, when they were moving through Germany, the M43 was the most common jacket for guys to be wearing. As I mentioned, guys would often live out of their pockets for days at a time, so having a little extra pocket space was much appreciated. In this first pocket here, I have some friction tape. That was like the duct tape of the period. You can fix anything with a little bit of friction tape. And then I have a bag of little personal hygiene items like a toothbrush, a razor, some razor blades, and shaving cream. I also have a fountain pen in that pocket. And then in my next pocket here, I have some items that maybe weren't necessary for survival, but were very important to soldiers nonetheless. Being in the Army can be boring. There was a lot of sitting around and trying to pass the time. So the Army issued out these Armed Service Edition books to soldiers. A ton of popular books at the time were available in these little pocket-sized booklets, so soldiers could take them on the move and read them whenever they had a spare moment. The two that I have here are the Bolin and then an education book about mathematics. I also have a couple other items here that would be common, like a letter and some postcards from regions in France that the 83rd had passed through. Writing to folks back home was very important, so most soldiers carried some type of writing equipment or paper. Next up, I have some Nescafe instant coffee. This would come in a soldier's K rations, and soldiers back then loved their coffee. Fun side note, this one here is an original that I actually found in the pocket of one of my original field jackets from World War II. After that, I have a candle here along with a couple books of matches from the time period. I hope you're starting to see what I mean about living out of your pockets. These guys carried everything they needed with them. Next up, I have an M2 frag grenade here. I also have this GI sewing kit. These were very common at the times. Most guys carried these because they wanted to be able to make small repairs to their stuff. If you ripped a hole in your pants in the field, you had to have some way to quickly repair that. All right, on to the final pocket of this field jacket, which contains a D ration bar. These were the emergency field rations. It was basically a chocolate nutrition bar, just chocolate with a couple other ingredients added to it. Next out of that pocket, I have a meat unit from a K ration. Some toilet paper, don't want to go without that, again from a soldier's K ration. This here is a fruit bar that's been pretty well crushed in my pocket, but again, came out of your rations. And then I have some candy stuffed in here, like some boiled sweets, some gum. Soldiers on the front lines loved their gum. I can't even express how often you see guys just chomping away on gum while they're going into combat. This might be a little more candy than the typical soldier would carry, but you'll notice that I don't have any cigarettes or tobacco items in my kit. Most soldiers back then smoked, and the K rations even contained cigarettes for soldiers. But since I don't smoke, I figure it doesn't make sense to carry that around. There were soldiers back then who didn't smoke, and if I didn't smoke and I got cigarettes in my rations, you best believe I'd be trading those for extra candies and coffee, stuff like that. That's all for my field jacket pockets. Let me take this off and show you what I'm wearing underneath this. This is a later version of the wool shirt. You can see it has these protective gas flaps in the cuffs here, and the cuffs have a simplified design compared to the earlier models. I also have a couple items stashed in my shirt pockets here. I keep my spoon in there to keep it a little cleaner than when it's in my field jacket. And like I mentioned, my spoon and my canteen cup was what I'd be eating out of for the most part. I also have a little pocket knife. These pocket knives were very useful. Most soldiers carried at least one pocket knife with them. This one is a World War II lineman's knife. Some guys just carried a personal pocket knife or maybe some other type of army pocket knife that they got their hands on, but you wouldn't see a soldier without a pocket knife. And finally, from that pocket, I have my trusty little harmonica here. I can't play the harmonica, at least not well, but I think it's fun to have one with me to pass the time. Thank you. Thank you. Now that was such an assault to the ears that it would probably get me shot by my own guys if I played that on the front lines. But practice makes perfect, I guess. In my other pocket over here, I have some more toilet paper. Can never have enough of that on hand. I also have another book of matches here in my pocket. And then I have some water purification tablets. These were halazone tablets that would have come in a soldier's K-rations. Now, if you haven't noticed, I'm wearing a couple pairs of pants right now. I have my normal wool pants on, then I have my HBT pants, my herringbone twill pants, and underneath both of those, I have a pair of wool long johns to keep me warm. Soldiers wouldn't always wear this combination of pants, but it was pretty common to wear some other type of pants over your wool pants. These HBT pants also have giant pockets on the side, so it gives you even more pocket space to carry your stuff. And what do I have in my HBT trouser pockets? Well, I'm glad you asked. This right here is a little pocket pistol. It's an Ivor Johnson chambered in .38 Smith & Wesson, just a little 5-shot hammerless revolver. This particular one is from the 1930s, and this was a common police item, so a lot of police officers would have carried this type of revolver. Now, soldiers were not issued these, but typically they weren't issued any type of sidearm, and it wasn't super uncommon for soldiers to find a way to get one on their own. Sometimes soldiers would have a pistol like this shipped to them overseas by loved ones back home. I believe sometimes even police departments would send over their extra pistols to soldiers on the front lines. Other times soldiers would pick up sidearms on the battlefield. German sidearms are one of the most common captured items that you see soldiers carrying by that point in the war. I included this so I could talk about it, but I wouldn't say this is indicative of what all soldiers carried by any means. These would be somewhat uncommon. Most soldiers did not have a pistol sent from home, but since some guys did, I thought that would be an interesting detail to include here. And finally, in my other pocket, I just have a little baggie here that has some extra cleaning patches to clean my little handgun there and my rifle, along with some extra ammunition for that little handgun. And now that I've covered everything inside of my pockets, let me tell you a little bit more about some of the other uniform items I have on. Underneath my wool shirt here, I'm wearing a thermal undershirt. This is a wool undershirt. It's very warm. It's a nice base layer. And underneath there, of course, I have my trusty dog tags. They're taped together with some friction tape so that they don't rattle as much. And then I also have a little P38 can opener on here. This would come in your rations and it's used to open your ration cans. And then if I get in my captain pose here, you can see I have double buckle boots on. These were very common with the 83rd Infantry later in the war. Soldiers often preferred these to the earlier Type 2 service shoes with leggings. These were a bit more comfortable, and not having to deal with leggings was a huge bonus. Those are super annoying. These boots have also been dubbed to make them waterproof. They're probably due for another coat here, it looks like, since I just used them. I think I've been through everything else, so as promised, now I'll tell you about my bedroll. As you can see, this is pretty chunky. Sometimes soldiers might carry a blanket or two with them or make a little hobo roll. They typically would not carry this around. Like I briefly mentioned earlier, this would be something that soldiers would throw on the back of a truck if they could, and then it would be brought to them on the front lines if they needed it. So what I have on the outside here is a shelter half. Now, the tents used during World War II were issued out as halves. So each soldier would get half a tent, they'd button them together to make a whole one, and then 2 people would sleep in it. So first up, you'll see my mess kit here. So as I mentioned, soldiers oftentimes didn't carry these. It's kind of big and bulky, and you just don't need it. Same goes for the knife and the fork that are contained in here. Guys just didn't need this stuff. You can eat pretty much anything with a spoon, so they just carried their spoon and canteen cup. And next here, you can see that I have a sleeping bag rolled up. I talked about in my most hated gear video how guys oftentimes didn't like to zip themselves inside of these sleeping bags on the front lines. Now, even if you had that sleeping bag, you typically also had a blanket or two. How many blankets you had just depended on how many you could carry, really, because more blankets is better. But for this bedroll, I have one sleeping bag, one blanket, and my wool overcoat. These wool overcoats are huge. As you can see, they're super thick and heavy. Guys typically did not want to carry these with them. They were either wearing them or they were stored away in their bedrolls. I will say though, these are one of the more stylish items for World War II. These definitely look a lot better than those dumb raincoats. And there you have it, guys. That is a full loadout of all the gear a soldier in the 83rd Infantry Division might have had while they were moving through Germany in April of 1945. And as I mentioned, there was a ton of variety. You guys might have had different field jackets, different bags, used different methods to carry their supplies, all kinds of stuff like that. But late in the war, a lot of these guys were experienced, or at least they learned from the veterans that were experienced. They knew what they needed to carry and what they needed to leave behind. And that type of mentality of traveling light and only carrying what you need as you're on the move is what allowed the soldiers of the 83rd Infantry Division to make such a rapid advance into Germany in April of 1945. Again, you guys can sign up for my Patreon through the link in the description to help support my work. And if you do, you'll get access to a full document with a list of everything that I showed here today, along with links for where you can buy those items, and some of my recommendations for how to shop for World War II equipment and build a World War II impression. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and for putting up with my hoarse voice while I'm getting over a cold, and I'll see you in the next one.